The air was heavy in the small suburban house on Maple Street. Evening had fallen, and a thick layer of fog had rolled in, wrapping around the house like an ominous veil. A soft, dim light flickered from the single lamp in the living room, casting long, distorted shadows across the room. In the far corner of the room, a large, cream-colored dog bed lay empty, the fabric worn and frayed from years of use. By the fireplace, an old wooden chest sat quietly, its once glorious finish now tarnished by time. It was this chest that had caused the change. Jessie Thompson sat on the worn-out sofa, her fingers nervously tapping the armrest as her gaze drifted toward the corner. It was around 2 weeks ago that she had found the chest. Unremarkable at first glance, yet it seemed to hold something powerful. After it had mysteriously arrived on her doorstep, Jessie had assumed it was simply an odd package mistakenly sent to her address. But that was before everything had started to change. Her golden retriever, Max, was no longer the playful, loving companion he had been for years. First, it had been small things, bizarre behavior that Jessie couldn't explain. Max, usually so affectionate, began to retreat into corners of the house, his eyes glued to empty spaces as if following something only he could see. Then, there were the growls, low, guttural growls in the dead of night, rising from deep within his throat. Jessie had chalked it up to an overactive imagination, or perhaps Max simply feeling a little off. But when the nightmares started, that was when she knew something was wrong. She was sitting at the kitchen table when it happened again. The sound of paws clicking across the wooden floor echoed through the quiet house. Jessie stood, looking toward the living room, her breath catching in her throat. Max was standing by the chest, his body rigid, his fur bristling like he was preparing to attack. "Max," she called softly, her voice shaking. He didn't move, his eyes locked onto her with an eerie, unsettling intensity. For a moment, there was no recognition in those eyes, just a hollow emptiness that sent a cold shiver down Jessie's spine. Max's tail, once a constant wag of joy, now hung limply between his legs. She took a cautious step forward, her heart pounding in her chest. "Max, what's going on?" The dog's gaze shifted, never leaving her face. But then something strange happened. Slowly, as if under some invisible command, Max turned his head toward the chest again, his eyes narrowing. Jessie swallowed hard, a strange sense of dread washing over her. Something was wrong. Max was no longer her sweet, loyal dog. He had become something else entirely. Jessie hesitated, but the strange compulsion to open the chest tugged at her. Her hand trembled as she reached for the latch. The old wood creaked under her touch, and she paused, unsure if she should proceed. The air in the room felt thicker now, stifling, like the house itself was holding its breath. But Jessie was determined. Whatever was happening to Max, she had to get to the bottom of it. With a sharp tug, the chest creaked open. Inside, nestled in a bed of velvet, was an ornate, intricately carved statue. It was unlike anything Jessie had ever seen. An odd, grotesque figure of a creature with elongated limbs and piercing eyes. Its features were sharp, angular, and disturbingly lifelike, as though it were watching her. Jessie recoiled, a sense of unease settling deep in her bones. The moment she touched the statue, a cold chill rushed through her fingertips. She pulled her hand back in shock, but the damage was already done. Max's growl escalated, louder and more menacing, his body tense as though ready to pounce. The dog's eyes shifted from eerie calm to something far more dangerous, something primal. And in that moment, Jessie understood. Whatever the statue was, it had unleashed something in Max, something dark and malevolent. She backed away slowly, her mind racing. She needed to get Max out of the house, away from whatever evil force had taken hold of him. But the moment she turned to run, the lights flickered violently, plunging the room into darkness. Then she heard it, a faint whisper, soft and sinister, coming from the very corner of the room where Max had stood. "You shouldn't have opened it." Jessie froze, her breath caught in her throat. The whisper wasn't Max's voice. It was something else, something deeper, more ancient. The whisper grew louder, now mixed with a growl that vibrated through the walls. Suddenly, Max lunged. Jessie gasped, her breath sharp and ragged as Max's body slammed into hers, knocking her backward with brutal force. The world spun as she collided with the floor, her vision going blurry for a split second. She could feel the warmth of his breath on her neck, his once familiar scent now twisted into something rotten and feral. His growl grew louder, vibrating the walls of the house. "Max, please," she pleaded, her voice shaking with fear. The dog's once loyal and loving eyes now gleamed with a strange, malevolent light. He didn't recognize her, didn't care about her anymore. He was lost, transformed into something dark. Max snarled, his teeth bared in a vicious grin as he lunged forward again. Jessie barely had time to react, rolling out of the way just in time to avoid his snapping jaws. Her heart pounded in her chest as she scrambled to her feet, backing away toward the hallway. She didn't know how much time had passed since she opened the chest. The whispers had stopped, but something far worse had begun. Max was no longer the dog she had known for years. He had become something far darker, far more dangerous. Her mind raced as she tried to make sense of what had happened. The statue. It had to be the statue. There was something wrong with it, something evil. The moment her fingers had brushed its cold surface, Max had changed. She had to get rid of it, destroy it. But how? What was she dealing with? Suddenly, a loud crash echoed from behind her, followed by the sound of rapid paws clicking across the floor. Jessie's heart leapt into her throat as she turned to face the source of the noise. Max was gaining on her, his body moving unnaturally fast, too fast. Fear surged through Jessie, but she forced herself to think. She had to get out of the house. She had to get somewhere safe. But where? The front door was too far away. The back door was locked. Her only chance was the basement. She turned and bolted down the hallway, her breath coming in short gasps. Max wasn't far behind. She could hear his growls growing louder, the sound of his claws scraping against the hardwood floor. Jessie's pulse raced as she reached the basement door and yanked it open. The stairs descended into the darkness below, the air damp and musty. Without a second thought, she descended into the depths of the house. The door slammed shut behind her with a deafening bang, but Jessie didn't stop to look back. She ran down the narrow stairs, her feet slipping on the slick wooden steps as she descended further into the basement. Her mind was a whirl of panic and confusion. What had happened to Max? What was the statue? And why had it affected him so? Jessie couldn't understand it, but she knew one thing for certain. Something was terribly wrong, and it was only going to get worse. The basement was cold, its stone walls damp and dark. The faint smell of mildew lingered in the air as Jessie reached the bottom. She paused to catch her breath, her ears straining for the sound of Max's heavy footsteps. But the basement was eerily quiet. Too quiet. She crept deeper into the room, the only light coming from a dim, flickering bulb above her head. The walls were lined with old wooden shelves, some of them covered in dusty boxes and forgotten trinkets. Her eyes darted from shelf to shelf, looking for something she could use to defend herself. But there was nothing, only the shadows. Suddenly, she froze. There, in the corner of the basement, was a figure. It was tall and thin, hunched over, its silhouette barely visible in the dim light. Jessie's breath caught in her throat as she took a step forward. She could make out the figure's features: sharp angles, too many joints, and a face twisted in a grotesque, mocking grin. It was the statue, the one she had found in the chest. It was alive. Jessie's blood ran cold as she realized the truth. The statue wasn't just some object. It was a vessel for something far worse, something ancient, and it had awakened. A low, guttural growl echoed through the room, and Jessie's heart stopped. She spun around, her body tensing as she faced Max, standing in the doorway, his eyes glowing with an unnatural light. "No," Jessie whispered, backing away slowly. She could hear the faint whispers again, growing louder, filling her mind with an unrelenting pressure. The creature from the chest had taken root in Max, changing him into something else entirely. And now the creature was here in the basement, and it was hungry. Max's eyes narrowed, his mouth curling into a snarl as he advanced toward her. Jessie's pulse raced as she stumbled backward, looking for a way out. The basement had no windows, no escape. She was trapped. Max's growl deepened, and Jessie's blood ran cold as he lunged at her, his body moving with a predatory grace that sent chills down her spine. Her heart thundered in her chest as she raised her arms instinctively, but it was too late. Max was on her. Jessie's breath caught in her throat as the world around her sank into an oppressive silence. The darkness was thick, almost suffocating. Her mind raced, desperately trying to adjust to the new, unsettling reality that surrounded her. Max's growl reverberated in the pitch-black space, but she could no longer see the familiar shape of her dog. Only the echo of his breath, hot and heavy, filled the air. For a moment, Jessie stood frozen, her back pressed against the cold stone wall of the basement. Fear gripped her, paralyzing her with its icy fingers. Her heart hammered in her chest, and her palms grew clammy. She strained to hear something, anything, to tell her where Max was. But the growl had stopped. Suddenly, she heard it. A low scrape, the sound of claws dragging across the stone floor. It was faint, like a whisper, but it was enough to send a jolt of terror through her veins. Jessie's eyes widened, trying to adjust to the darkness, but it was impossible. The air felt heavier now, like something was pressing down on her, suffocating her thoughts. "Max," she whispered, her voice trembling, barely audible in the stillness. The darkness shifted. It was like a shadow moving in the corner of her vision. She turned, her heart leaping into her throat. She couldn't see the creature, but she could feel its presence, feel the weight of its malevolent gaze bearing down on her. Jessie's blood ran cold as she realized what was happening. Whatever had taken over Max had changed him. It was no longer just her dog. It was something worse, something older, something evil. The scraping sound grew louder, closer. "Max?" Jessie repeated, her voice barely a breath now. There was no response. Instead, she heard the unmistakable sound of teeth clicking together, a terrible, rhythmic sound that sent a shiver down her spine. Jessie turned again, eyes wide, her body tense and poised for flight, but there was nowhere to go. The basement seemed to stretch endlessly, the walls closing in on her, and she knew with a deep, unsettling certainty that she wasn't alone. Whatever had possessed Max was in here with her. Suddenly, the light flickered, a brief, fleeting glow illuminating the basement. In that brief moment, Jessie saw it. A pair of glowing eyes, peering out from the corner of the room. They were unnatural, glowing like embers in the dark. And they weren't Max's eyes. "Get out!" Jessie screamed, her voice breaking, but it was too late. The creature lunged. Jessie stumbled backward, barely managing to keep her balance, as the monstrous form of Max's possessed body hurtled toward her. She dodged at the last second, feeling the rush of air as his twisted, snarling form passed her by, narrowly missing her by inches. The smell of decay, of something rancid and dead, filled her nostrils as the creature skidded to a stop, its eyes fixed on her, unblinking. Max was no longer her loyal pet. He had become something much darker, something that thrived on fear, on destruction. His body seemed to flicker between forms, now a twisted, gaunt version of the dog she once knew, now something far more horrific. Its limbs too long, its skin pulled taut, and its mouth hanging open in a grotesque grin. Jessie's stomach churned, bile rising in her throat, but she fought back the urge to vomit. She couldn't afford to lose control now. She needed a plan. She needed to think, to survive. As Max's growl intensified, Jessie's mind raced, searching for a way out of the basement. The back door was locked. The front door was too far away. And the stairs? She couldn't get back up there with Max lurking so close. She needed to buy herself time. She needed a weapon. Her eyes scanned the dark, cluttered basement. Boxes, old furniture, dusty shelves. Nothing seemed useful. Then, in the far corner, her gaze landed on an old, rusted shovel. It was heavy, the long wooden handle battered and worn, but it would do. She grabbed it, the handle cold against her palm. The weight of it gave her a sense of control, even if only a small one. Jessie took a deep breath, steeling herself. She had to face the creature, had to fight back or risk being consumed by it. "Come on, Max," she muttered, her voice thick with fear and determination. "Come on, you bastard." With a primal scream, Jessie swung the shovel in the direction of the creature, her arms shaking as she connected with something solid. The shovel cracked against Max's shoulder, sending a shudder of resistance through her body. It wasn't enough. The creature barely flinched, its glowing eyes narrowing as it let out a low, menacing growl. It was angry now. Jessie swung again, but Max was faster. The creature dodged, its movements unnatural and jerky, like it wasn't fully bound to this world. It lunged at her, jaws snapping, but Jessie managed to duck, the creature's teeth barely grazing her hair. She was running out of time. The ground beneath her shook. Jessie's heart skipped a beat as the basement door suddenly slammed open, the creaking hinges screeching against the stone walls. She whipped around, her eyes wide with confusion. Through the open door stood an unfamiliar figure, silhouetted against the dim light from the hallway above. It was a man. He was tall, dressed in a long coat, his face obscured by shadows. But the moment he stepped forward, Jessie could see the gleam of something strange in his eyes, something unsettlingly familiar, like the gleam in Max's. Jessie's heart pounded in her chest, each beat resonating like thunder in her ears. She couldn't tear her eyes away from the figure in the doorway, a strange man standing like a sentinel, his shadow stretching ominously over the floor. The air in the basement had grown colder, as if the very atmosphere was reacting to his presence, turning thick with dread. Max, or whatever he had become, stood motionless, his head tilted at an odd angle. The creature's glowing eyes flickered with an unsettling familiarity, as though it recognized the man. But the beast's body remained taut, coiled like a spring, ready to attack. The man stepped into the room, his dark coat brushing the floor as he moved. Jessie's pulse quickened, her body tense with the need to flee. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to escape, but her legs felt heavy, her feet glued to the floor as if some invisible force held her in place. The man's gaze never wavered from the creature. His voice, when it came, was low, commanding, but strangely calm. "Max," he said, his voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "Stop. The creature's ears twitched at the sound of the name, but it didn't react immediately. It stood there, motionless for a moment that stretched far too long. Jesse's eyes flicked between the man and the monstrous form of Max. Could this person be the key to stopping whatever had overtaken her dog? Or was he, too, part of the nightmare? The man took another step forward, his boots clicking sharply against the concrete floor. Jesse felt a surge of panic, but there was nowhere to go. The stairs, the door, everything felt so far out of reach. The basement was a tomb, and she was trapped inside it. "Max," the man said again, more forcefully this time. "Obey." There was a long pause, the air thick with anticipation, before the creature suddenly dropped to the floor. It let out a low, guttural growl as it lowered its body, but Jesse could see the subtle shift in its posture. It wasn't the same wild animal it had been moments ago. Something had changed. Max, no, the thing that had once been Max, seemed to be responding to the man's voice, as though the man had some kind of control over it. Jesse's breath hitched in her throat. She didn't know whether to feel relief or horror. Was this man some kind of savior, or was he the source of the evil that had overtaken Max? Who are you?" Jesse's voice cracked as she finally managed to speak, her words barely a whisper in the oppressive silence. The man turned slowly toward her, his face still shrouded in shadow. His eyes gleamed faintly in the dim light, an unnatural, almost predatory gleam. He didn't answer immediately, his gaze scanning her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. Finally, he spoke. "Does it matter?" His voice was smooth, cold, and almost too calm. "What matters is that I can control him. I can make him stop. I can make him listen." Jesse felt a shiver run down her spine. The creature at her feet had lowered its head, but Jesse still saw the flicker of intelligence in its eyes. It wasn't Max, not really. Not anymore. "What did you do to him?" Jesse demanded, her voice stronger now, fueled by a mix of fear and anger. "What's happening to my dog?" The man took another step forward, closing the distance between them, his eyes never leaving her face. He stopped just in front of Max, and the creature's head snapped up at the sound of his movement, its eyes narrowing, but it didn't move any closer. It was as if the man held some invisible leash, a chain Jesse couldn't see but could feel in the way Max obeyed his commands. "The question isn't what I did to him," the man said softly, his voice now a low murmur that sent a chill crawling across Jesse's skin. "The question is, what will you do now?" Jessie swallowed hard, her pulse quickening. She wanted to run, to get out of there, but the man was standing between her and the stairs, and Max, or whatever this creature was, blocked her escape. She was trapped. She had no choice but to face him. "I don't know what's happening," Jessie said, her voice shaking despite her best efforts to sound confident. "I just want my dog back. I want things to go back to normal." The man's lips curled into a smile, though it was more a baring of teeth than anything resembling warmth. "Normal," he repeated softly. "There is no normal anymore, girl. Not for Max. Not for you." Jessie recoiled, the words hitting her like a slap. She wanted to shout, to scream at him to tell her what he meant, but the cold look in his eyes silenced her. He was dangerous, she realized. He was the kind of person who didn't need to raise his voice to make people tremble. Max let out another low growl, this one directed at Jessie, but it didn't approach her. The creature seemed confused, torn between its loyalty to Jessie and the man's commands. Jessie's heart skipped a beat as she realized that whatever this man had done to Max, it had twisted him beyond recognition. It wasn't just her dog anymore. It was something else, something far more sinister. "Why is he like this?" Jessie asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. "What happened to him?" The man's smile widened, though there was no joy in it. "You were foolish, girl," he said. his voice suddenly sharp, as if he were scolding her. "You found it. You found what you shouldn't have." Jesse's mind raced, trying to piece together his words. What did I find?" The man didn't answer right away. Instead, he turned his gaze toward the small, ancient-looking box on the floor near the far wall, the one Jesse had found earlier. It was almost forgotten now, swallowed by the chaos of the moment. But its presence still haunted the room, as though it were somehow responsible for everything that had happened. "You opened it," the man continued, his tone dark and final. "And now you've unleashed something that can never be put back." The realization hit Jesse like a bolt of lightning. The box, the strange object Max had sniffed, the way everything had spiraled out of control ever since. But there was one thing she couldn't understand. "Who are you?" Jessie demanded once more, her voice rising with frustration. "Why are you here?" The man didn't answer right away. Instead, he crouched down, his hands hovering just inches above Max's head. He didn't touch the creature, but somehow, the way he stood made it clear that Max would obey him, no matter what. "I am the one who controls the darkness," the man said finally, his voice low and filled with a strange reverence. "And I am the one who can end it. But you must choose, Jessie." Jessie's breath hitched in her chest. She had no idea what he meant, but she had the terrible feeling that she was about to find out. Jessie stood frozen, her mind racing, but her body unwilling to move. The man's words hung in the air like a dark cloud, suffocating her thoughts. Max was gone. There was no saving him. But the more she tried to push away the fear creeping into her heart, the more she felt the oppressive weight of the situation. The man standing before her exuded an eerie sense of control, like he was the master of some unspeakable power, and Max, well, Max was nothing more than a vessel for that power now. Jessie could feel the room closing in around her, the walls pressing in with every breath she took. Max was still by her feet, but he no longer seemed like her dog. His once warm, loving eyes had turned into cold, calculating orbs. His body was stiff, rigid with tension, and his growls had become low, guttural sounds, almost like an animal in distress. He wasn't herself, not anymore. But what had happened to him? And who was this man? "What do you mean, the possession has already begun?" Jessie asked, her voice trembling despite her best effort to sound confident. She took a step back, her eyes never leaving the man. The man finally turned toward her, his lips curling into a chilling smile, one that sent a shiver up Jessie's spine. "You opened the box, girl," he said, his voice low and dark. "That was your first mistake." Jessie's heart skipped a beat as she remembered the strange box in the corner of the basement. The box that she had foolishly opened. She had thought it was just an old trinket, some forgotten relic. But now everything had spiraled out of control. It was more than just an old object. It was the key to unleashing something that should have stayed hidden. "You see," the man continued, his voice now laced with amusement, "there are things in this world that should never be disturbed. This box, it contains a dark force, a power far older than you can imagine. And your dog, Max, he's the one who became its first victim." Jessie could barely breathe. Every word the man spoke felt like a weight on her chest. She glanced down at Max, who was still at her feet, his eyes fixed on the man like a puppet awaiting his next command. "Max, my dog," Jessie whispered. "What happened to him?" The man's smile faded, replaced with a look of cold indifference. "He's no longer the dog you once knew. He's a vessel for something far more dangerous. And that darkness, it's spreading." Jessie felt her stomach twist. What had she done? If only she hadn't opened that cursed box, none of this would have happened. But it was too late now. She had unleashed something that could not be undone. "What do you want from me?" Jessie asked, her voice barely audible. "Why are you here?" The man's eyes glinted with a strange mix of pity and amusement. "I'm here because you're the key, Jessie. You and that dog of yours." Jessie blinked, confused. "What do you mean?" He walked toward her, his presence imposing. "You opened the box. You're the one who started this chain of events. Now, you must finish it." Jessie took a step back, her mind racing. "What do you want me to do?" The man reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small, twisted piece of metal. It was a key, old and rusted, but something about it made Jessie's stomach turn. "This key," the man said, holding it up for her to see, "is the final piece of the puzzle. The box opened the gateway, but it's incomplete. You need this to finish the ritual." Jessie's pulse raced. "Ritual? What are you talking about?" The man stepped closer, his face inches from hers. "You don't understand, do you? The darkness inside Max. It's hungry. It needs to feed, and only the ritual can bind it. You're the only one who can stop it now." Jessie's heart pounded in her chest. She felt like she was on the edge of some terrible precipice. One wrong step and everything would fall apart. She couldn't even process everything he was saying. How could she possibly help this man, or her dog, after everything that had already happened? "Why me?" Jessie managed to choke out. "Why am I the one who has to do this?" The man's lips curled into a sadistic grin. "Because, Jessie, you're the one who brought it into the world. Now, you're the only one who can banish it." A cold chill ran through Jessie as she looked down at Max. She could feel the weight of his eyes on her, watching her every move, waiting for her to make the wrong decision. The fear that had been building inside her began to bubble over into a cold sweat. She didn't know what to do, but something inside her told her that she had no choice. "What happens if I don't?" she asked, barely able to keep her voice steady. The man's smile faltered for just a moment, a flash of something darker crossing his features. "If you don't, Max will be lost forever, and the darkness inside him will spread. It won't stop with him. It will infect everything. It will consume everything you care about, everyone you know." Jessie felt her breath catch in her throat. She could already hear the echo of those words, the weight of them pressing down on her like a vice. If she didn't do this, everything would be lost. Max, her family, everything. It would all be swallowed by the darkness. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "I can't. I won't." The man's face twisted into an expression of disgust. "You have no choice, Jessie. The moment you opened that box, you signed your fate. Now you must finish what you started." Max growled low, his eyes flicking toward the man, as if awaiting his next command. But Jessie didn't look at him. She couldn't. She had to focus. She had to think. There had to be another way. But there wasn't. Not anymore. The man extended the key toward her. "Take it," he said, his voice now a whisper, "and finish the ritual. Save your dog, or watch everything you love burn." Jessie's fingers trembled as she reached for the twisted key, its cold metal sending a shiver up her spine. The man's eyes never left her, his expression one of cruel satisfaction, as though he knew what she would do next. Max, still standing motionless by her side, stared at her, his gaze now completely devoid of the warmth he once had. There was nothing left of the dog she had loved, only the creature that had taken his place. I can't," Jessie muttered, her voice barely above a whisper. "This isn't right. There has to be another way." The man's lips curled into a slow, menacing smile. "You think there's another way, girl? You think there's a way to save your dog, your home, and yourself without completing the ritual? Think again." His words sent a chill down her spine, but Jessie refused to let fear control her. She wasn't ready to give in. Not yet. Her eyes darted between the key and Max, Could she really go through with this? Could she trust this man, whoever he was, when all he had done was fill her with terror? "Please, I just want my dog back," Jessie said, her voice shaking. "I want things to go back to normal. Please, tell me there's another way." The man stepped closer, his eyes narrowing, as if savoring the desperation in her voice. "You should have thought of that before you opened the box, Jessie. Now you're in this deep, and there's no turning back. There's no going back to normal. This is your new reality." Max growled, a low, guttural sound that made Jessie's blood run cold. His fur was stiff, his body taut, and he seemed to be waiting for something. A command, perhaps, or for her to make the wrong choice. Jessie swallowed hard, fighting the urge to run. She looked down at the key in her hand. The coldness of it seemed to pierce through her, sinking into her bones. She could feel the weight of the man's words pressing on her chest, suffocating her. "You have two choices, Jessie," the man continued, his voice now smooth, almost hypnotic. "You either finish the ritual and bind the darkness to Max, or you let him continue down this path and watch him destroy everything you care about." Jessie's mind raced. She wanted to scream, to protest, to fight back against the terrible reality that was unfolding around her. But the weight of the man's words was undeniable. She had seen what Max had become. She had witnessed the change in him, the malevolent force taking hold of his soul. There was no denying it now. Whatever was inside him, whatever had been unleashed by the box, was real. She stared at the key, her pulse quickening. There was no easy answer, no clean way out. If she didn't act, if she didn't complete the ritual, then Max would remain lost to her forever, and the darkness would continue to spread. But if she did complete the ritual, what would that mean? Would she be condemning herself or Max to a fate worse than death? Could there even be a way to reverse this? Jessie's mind was a whirl of conflicting thoughts. She couldn't lose Max, but she didn't want to be the one to destroy him, to bind him to something dark and twisted. But the man had made it clear, if she didn't act, everything would be lost. "Please," Jessie whispered, her voice barely audible. "Tell me what to do." The man's eyes gleamed as he stepped even closer, his breath cold against her skin. "You must take the key to the altar. There's a place, hidden deep within the house, where the ritual must be completed. Only then will you have the power to bind the darkness inside Max. Once you do that, the entity will be contained." "Altar?" Jessie asked, her voice shaking. "What altar? Where is it?" The man gave a slight chuckle, his dark eyes flashing with amusement. "You'll know it when you see it. Trust me. The altar is the only place where the ritual can be completed. But be warned, it's not just the darkness you'll be fighting. There's something else in that room. Something far worse than what you've encountered so far." Jessie's heart skipped a beat. She could feel the weight of the man's words pressing down on her chest. A new wave of fear washed over her. What could be worse than what she had already seen? Max's transformation? The feeling of being trapped in a nightmare she couldn't escape? She looked down at Max, his eyes still locked on her. The bond they had shared was gone, replaced by something cold and unfamiliar. She had to do this. She had no choice. The ritual was the only way to save Max. With a deep breath, Jessie straightened up and looked at the man. "Where is this altar?" she asked, her voice filled with determination. "Tell me." The man smiled, the expression one of triumph. "Follow the hallway to the end. The door at the farthest corner of the house. That's where you'll find it. But be careful, Jessie. The darkness won't make it easy for you." Before Jessie could respond, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows. She stood frozen for a moment, unsure if she had the strength to go on. But the thought of Max, of the dog she had once known, pushed her forward. Max let out another growl, low and threatening. It was a sound she had never heard from him before, and it made her blood run cold. The creature that had once been her loyal pet was now something else entirely, something dangerous. Jessie didn't hesitate. She grabbed the key and turned toward the hallway, walking with determination but a deep sense of dread filling her chest. Every step felt heavier than the last, and the silence of the house was deafening. At the end of the hallway, the door loomed before her, old, creaky, and sinister. Jessie felt the weight of it bearing down on her, knowing that once she stepped through, there would be no turning back. With a deep breath, she reached for the door handle. Jessie's heart raced as she stepped into the room, the door creaking closed behind her with a deafening finality. The darkness that enveloped her was suffocating, its coldness unlike anything she had ever felt before. It was as though the very air itself had turned to ice, pressing down on her chest, making it harder to breathe. She could hear the sound of her pulse thudding in her ears as she took slow, tentative steps forward. The room was vast, larger than any other room in the house, and yet the shadows seemed to stretch endlessly, swallowing everything in their path. Jessie's eyes darted around, but there was no sign of the altar the man had spoken of. The only thing she could see clearly were the faint outlines of strange, twisted shapes that seemed to move and shift in the periphery of her vision, just beyond her reach. It was as though the darkness itself was alive, watching her every move. She tightened her grip on the key, her fingers growing numb from the cold. She had no idea what she was looking for, but something told her that the altar would reveal itself in its own time. Jessie had no choice but to keep going. She had come too far to turn back now. As she made her way deeper into the room, her eyes began to adjust to the dim light. She could just make out the faint outline of an old stone altar at the far end, its surface carved with intricate symbols that twisted and spiraled in unnatural patterns. The altar seemed to glow faintly, as though it were alive with a malevolent energy, pulsing with an otherworldly power. Max, who had been following her, was now at her side, his growls growing louder and more menacing with each step she took. Jessie glanced down at him, but his eyes had changed. They were no longer the soft, brown eyes of the dog she had loved. They were now cold, lifeless, reflecting nothing but emptiness and malice. With every passing moment, Max's transformation became more apparent. His fur was now matted and twisted, his body contorted in unnatural ways, his once sweet bark replaced by guttural growls that sent chills down her spine. The creature that had once been her loyal pet was now a monster, a shadow of the dog she had known. Jessie stopped a few feet from the altar, her breath catching in her throat. The air around it felt thick, oppressive, as if the darkness itself was pressing in on her. She could feel the weight of the ritual looming over her. This was the moment she had been dreading, the moment that would determine everything. She had to make a choice. Max's growls became more frantic as he moved closer to the altar. His eyes locked onto the glowing symbols etched into its surface. Jessie could feel the pull of the altar as if it were calling to her, beckoning her to complete the ritual. She had no idea what she was about to unleash, but she knew it was the only way to save Max, or what was left of him. With shaking hands, Jessie stepped forward, her fingers brushing against the cold stone of the altar. The moment she touched it, a shock of energy coursed through her, sending a wave of heat and cold rushing through her body. It was as though something had been awakened, and she could feel the power of the ritual thrumming beneath her skin. Max snarled, his fur standing on end as he circled the altar. The creature that had once been her pet seemed to be drawn to it, as though it were connected to the darkness that had overtaken him. Jessie could see the hunger in his eyes, the twisted desire to consume everything around him. Her heart pounded in her chest as she looked down at the key in her hand. The man had told her to use it to complete the ritual, but she had no idea what would happen once she did. The fear was almost overwhelming, but there was no turning back now. She had come this far and she couldn't stop now. Jessie took a deep breath and placed the key into the slot on the altar. The moment she did, the room seemed to shift, as though the walls were closing in on her. A deafening sound filled the air, like the screaming of thousands of voices, echoing through the room. Jessie stumbled back, her hands instinctively reaching for Max, but he was no longer the dog she had known. He was something else entirely, something dark and terrifying. Max lunged forward, his mouth opening wide, revealing rows of jagged teeth that gleamed in the dim light. Jessie's heart skipped a beat as she watched the creature she had once loved charge at her. But it wasn't just the beast that terrified her. It was the feeling, the overwhelming sensation that something far worse was lurking in the shadows, waiting to claim her. The altar began to glow brighter, its symbols shifting and twisting as if they were alive. The air around her crackled with energy, and Jessie felt her body grow cold, as though the very essence of her soul was being drained. She could feel the darkness crawling under her skin, worming its way into her heart. Max growled, his eyes locked on hers, but Jessie couldn't move. The darkness had taken hold of her, and she was frozen in place, unable to escape the grip of the ritual she had started. Suddenly, a voice, soft but insistent, whispered in her ear, "Do it." The voice wasn't the man's. It wasn't even Max's. It was something older, something far more ancient. Jessie's eyes widened in horror as the voice echoed in her mind, urging her to finish what she had started. She knew what she had to do. She had to make the ultimate sacrifice, the one choice that would determine whether Max would live or whether she would lose him forever. Jessie's heart raced in her chest as she stood frozen before the altar. The air around her seemed to throb with energy, a dark, pulsating force that made her skin crawl. The symbols on the altar had shifted, now glowing with a fierce, unearthly light. Her trembling fingers hovered over the ritual's final piece, a small black crystal that seemed to hum with a life of its own. She had come so far, but now the weight of her decision felt heavier than ever. Max growled behind her, the sound low and menacing. His once adoring eyes had become wild and soulless, his form now a twisted reflection of the creature he had once been. His every movement was jerky, unnatural, as though his very being was being torn apart and remade in the darkness. Jessie could feel the pull of the altar, the darkness trying to take root within her, but she couldn't stop now. She had to make the ultimate choice: finish the ritual and risk losing herself, or let Max fall deeper into the grip of the supernatural force that had taken him. The voice that had whispered in her ear still lingered in her mind, urging her to complete the ritual. Do it. It was a command, not a plea. Jessie's fingers tightened around the black crystal as her mind raced. Her thoughts tangled in confusion and fear. She could hear the footsteps again, slow, deliberate, as though someone or something was approaching from behind. She whipped around, her pulse quickening, her breath coming in shallow gasps. But there was no one there, only darkness. Her eyes darted back to Max, and she saw that he was no longer in front of her. In the span of a heartbeat, he had vanished. She spun in a circle, searching the shadows for any sign of him, but it was as though the room itself had swallowed him whole. "Max," she whispered, her voice trembling with fear. "Max!" But the room remained silent. The darkness pressed in on her, its suffocating weight making it difficult to breathe. Jessie's head spun as she fought to make sense of what was happening. Had the ritual worked? Had she released something far more dangerous than she could have ever imagined? The whisper came again, this time louder, more insistent. "Do it now." Jesse's hand reached for the black crystal again. But this time, it wasn't a choice. It was as if her body moved on its own, as though the ritual had taken over. She had no control, no power to stop herself as she placed the crystal into the altar's dark void. The moment the crystal touched the surface, a violent surge of energy erupted from the altar, knocking Jessie backward. She crashed to the floor, her body hitting the cold stone with a sickening thud. The world around her spun, and she felt a wave of nausea flood her senses. But it wasn't just the physical pain that overwhelmed her. It was the darkness, the suffocating, all-encompassing presence that seemed to be reaching into her very soul. Max's growls echoed through the room, now a low, guttural sound that seemed to come from every direction. Jessie struggled to sit up, her mind foggy, but she could hear the unmistakable sound of claws scraping against the stone floor. The shadows in the room seemed to move, shifting and twisting like dark tendrils that were reaching out to claim her. Jessie looked up, her breath catching in her throat as she saw Max. But he wasn't the dog she had once known. He was something else, something far darker. Max's body had changed. His fur was now matted and twisted, his eyes glowing with an eerie, unnatural light. His once playful bark had transformed into a blood-curdling snarl that sent shivers down Jessie's spine. He was no longer the creature she had loved and cared for. He was something far more sinister, something that had been twisted by the darkness she had unleashed. The room around her seemed to pulsate with a malevolent energy, as though the very walls were alive, closing in on her. The symbols on the altar glowed brighter now, their twisted patterns shifting and changing as though they were alive, mocking her with their terrible power. Jessie's hands shook as she pushed herself to her feet, her eyes locked on Max. "Max," she whispered again, her voice breaking. Please come back." But Max only snarled, his mouth opening wide to reveal rows of jagged, blood-stained teeth. He advanced toward her, his movements unnaturally fast, his claws scraping the stone with each step. Jessie stumbled backward, her mind racing as she tried to make sense of what was happening. This wasn't her dog. It wasn't Max. It was something else, something she had brought into being by completing the ritual. But what had she done? Her heart pounded in her chest as she looked around the room, desperately searching for a way out. The darkness seemed to close in on her from every angle, and the whispers, those soft, insistent whispers, grew louder in her mind. "Sacrifice," the voice hissed. "It's the only way." Jessie's mind whirled with panic. The creature in front of her wasn't just Max. It was a manifestation of the darkness that had consumed him, and now it wanted something in return. She could feel it, a cold, gnawing hunger that seemed to radiate from the creature in waves. It wanted more. It wanted her. She backed away, her legs trembling beneath her as she struggled to breathe. Her thoughts scattered like leaves in the wind as she tried to think of a way out. There had to be a way to reverse the ritual, something she could do to undo the damage she had caused. But there was nothing. Nothing but the altar. Nothing but Max. "Max," she whispered one last time, her voice barely a breath. "I'm sorry." Her hand reached for the altar once more, her fingers brushing the stone surface. But before she could do anything, the darkness erupted around her. The walls seemed to bend and twist, as if the very fabric of reality were being torn apart. Jessie screamed, the sound lost in the overwhelming cacophony of whispers and growls that filled the room. Max lunged at her, his jaws snapping shut just inches from her face. And then everything went dark.